In the misty dawn of medieval England, Princess Eleanor found herself surrounded by 30 merciless bandits. The bodies of her royal guard scattered around her. Death seemed certain until a stranger appeared from the fog, armed with nothing but a blacksmith's hammer. This mysterious man fought with inhuman skill, defeating all 30 attackers before vanishing into the forest without revealing his name or accepting thanks. Consumed by the memory of steel-grey eyes that had looked into her soul, Eleanor begins a desperate search for her savior, defying her impending political marriage and the strict boundaries of her royal station. But the truth she uncovers will shake the very foundations of the kingdom. Who is this blacksmith with the fighting skills of a warrior? What secret does he harbor that kept him hidden for 40 years? And what impossible choice will Eleanor have to make when duty and love collide in a web of royal intrigue, forbidden passion, and a destiny neither of them can escape? If you enjoyed this tale of sacrifice, secret royal blood, and a love that defies all odds, please follow our channel for more emotional medieval stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Like and comment to let us know where you're watching from, and share with someone who appreciates a story where true love conquers all, even when it seems utterly impossible. The morning mist hung heavy over the ancient forest, weaving between the gnarled oaks like spectral fingers, obscuring paths and secrets alike. In this ethereal silence, only the soft padding of hooves against damp earth could be heard, as Princess Eleanor's royal procession made its way through what they believed to be safe passage toward the northern provinces. Eleanor, a woman of 38, whose beauty had only deepened with the passing years, sat tall in her saddle despite the early hour. Her auburn hair, woven with delicate silver threads that caught the meager light filtering through the canopy, was partially concealed beneath a hood of midnight blue velvet. Her eyes, the color of summer storms, scanned the surrounding mist, with a wariness born from years at court, where danger often came cloaked in pleasantries. "We should reach the village by midday, Your Highness," her captain of the guard announced, his voice carrying a false confidence that did not escape Eleanor's notice. Something felt wrong. The birds had gone silent, and the forest held its breath. When it happened, it came with brutal swiftness. Arrows whistled through the mist, finding their marks in the throats of her guards before they could even draw their swords. Shouts of alarm gave way to screams of agony as mounted men emerged from the fog like demons from nightmare, their faces concealed behind crude masks, their blades already slick with blood. "Protect the princess!" came the desperate cry as her remaining guards formed a circle around her, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. 30 bandits at least, Eleanor counted in horror as her horse reared in panic, throwing her to the ground. The impact drove the breath from her lungs, and she felt the sharp sting as her knees scraped against rock and root, her fine dress tearing. As she scrambled backward, the sounds of battle, metal against metal, the wet thud of blades finding flesh, men's dying breaths, created a hellish cacophony around her. Eleanor watched as her last defender fell, his lifeblood staining the forest floor crimson, his eyes wide with the shock of death. "Well, well," a gruff voice cut through the sudden quiet. "What fortune smiles upon us today, brothers?" The king's daughter herself, the leader of the bandits, stepped forward, his face scarred beneath his half-mask, his eyes gleaming with malice and something far more terrifying. "They say your father would pay any price for your safe return. I wonder what he would give to spare you certain indignities." Eleanor backed away until her shoulders met the unyielding trunk of an ancient oak. Her fingers clutched at mud and leaves, searching desperately for anything that might serve as a weapon. "You will regret this," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Every man in England will hunt you down." The bandits laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "By then, it will be too late for you, Princess." the leader replied, taking another step closer. The circle of men tightened around her, their breath visible in the cool morning air, their intentions clear in their hungry eyes. It was then, in that moment of utter despair, that the mist seemed to part with purpose. A figure emerged from the swirling vapor, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. The bandits turned, momentarily distracted, and Eleanor saw him clearly for the first time. He stood over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that spoke of years of labor. His chestnut hair, tousled and damp from the mist, framed a face that might have been carved from weathered stone, all sharp angles and quiet determination. But it was his eyes that held her, grey as tempered steel, revealing neither fear nor hesitation, only a controlled fury that seemed to emanate from someplace deep within. In his right hand he carried what appeared to be a blacksmith's hammer, its head stained with years of forge work. In his left, a crude shield that looked to have been fashioned from a tavern table's top. He wore no armor, only simple leather garments and a worn cloak that had seen better days. "What's this, then?" the bandit leader sneered. "A lone hero come to die?" The stranger said nothing, merely adjusted his grip on the hammer. It should have been comical. One man armed with a craftsman's tool against 30 hardened killers. Yet, not one of the bandits laughed. "Kill him," the leader ordered, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty. What followed would later be described by Eleanor as a dance of death, so beautiful and terrible that it seemed to transcend the mortal realm. The stranger moved with a speed that defied belief, the hammer in his hand no longer a tool, but an extension of his will. The first bandit fell with his skull crushed before he could even raise his sword. The second lost his jaw to an upward swing that sent teeth scattering like bloody pearls. The bandits rushed him en masse then, believing their numbers would overwhelm him. They were wrong. The stranger ducked, pivoted, and struck with a grace that seemed impossible for a man of his size. Each blow was precisely delivered, each movement economical and deadly. Blood sprayed in crimson arcs as the hammer found its marks again and again. Eleanor watched, transfixed, as her unlikely savior fought with silent intensity. There was something hauntingly familiar about him, perhaps in the set of his jaw or the way he moved, that tugged at the edges of her memory. A bandit lunged at him from behind, and Eleanor cried out a warning. The stranger spun, but not before. The blade opened a deep gash across his upper arm. He showed no sign of pain, merely adjusted his stance and continued his grim work. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than moments. Bodies littered the forest floor, the mist now tinged red with blood, and the last gasps of dying men. The bandit leader, seeing his forces decimated, turned to flee, but the stranger's arm shot out, releasing the hammer in a perfect arc that caught the man at the base of his skull. He dropped without a sound. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the stranger's heavy breathing and the distant call of a crow. Eleanor remained frozen against the tree, unable to comprehend the impossible scene before her. 30 men lay dead or dying, felled by a single individual armed with nothing but a blacksmith's hammer and what appeared to be inhuman determination. The stranger turned to her then, his grey eyes finding hers across the blood-soaked clearing. He approached slowly, as one might approach a frightened deer, and knelt beside her. Blood flowed freely from the wound on his arm, but he seemed oblivious to it. Up close, Eleanor could see that he was perhaps 40 years of age, his face marked by subtle lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. "Are you hurt, Your Highness?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man who had just demonstrated such violence. It was deep, with the hint of a northern accent, and carried a warmth that seemed at odds with his fearsome appearance. Eleanor shook her head, unable to find her voice. Their eyes met, and in that moment something passed between them, something profound and inexplicable. She felt as though she were falling into those steel-grey depths, glimpsing shadows of past pain and quiet strength. Her hand moved of its own accord, reaching toward his face with a need she didn't understand. Before her fingers could make contact, he stood abruptly, breaking the spell. He glanced down at his bloodied hammer, then back at her, his expression now guarded. "Wait," Eleanor finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" The stranger looked at her for what seemed an eternity, something unreadable shifting behind his eyes, regret, perhaps, or longing. Then he simply shook his head. "No one of consequence, Your Highness." Before she could protest, he turned and walked back into the mist from which he had emerged. The sound of breaking branches marked his passage as he disappeared between the ancient trees, leaving Eleanor alone amidst the aftermath of slaughter. "Wait," she called, finding her strength at last, struggling to her feet despite her torn dress and bloodied knees. "Please, I must know your name," but only silence answered her desperate cries. The mist swallowed him completely, as though he had never been more than an apparition, a spirit conjured by her fear and desperation. With trembling hands, Eleanor sank back to the ground, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. She wept, not only from the shock of survival, but from an inexplicable sense of loss, as though something precious had been offered and then withdrawn before she could grasp it. When her father's search party found her hours later, she was still sitting among the dead, staring into the forest where her savior had vanished. They marveled at the carnage, unable to believe her tale of a single man with a hammer defeating 30 armed bandits. "It must have been a company of soldiers," the new captain insisted. "No single man could accomplish such a feat." But Eleanor knew what she had seen. As they escorted her back to the castle, her eyes remained fixed on the shadowy forest. In the days that followed, she refused food, barely slept, and spoke little. Her mind was consumed by a single thought, a face, a pair of steel-grey eyes that had looked into hers with an intensity that had awakened something dormant within her soul. "I will find you," she whispered to the night as she stood at her chamber window, gazing out over the moonlit kingdom. "Whoever you are, wherever you hide, I will find you." And with that promise made to the stars and to herself, Princess Eleanor began a quest that would change her life and the fate of the kingdom forever. The fire in the small forge glowed orange-red in the dimming light of dusk, its heat a stark contrast to the chill autumn air settling over the village of Oakenfield. Aidan stood before the anvil, his powerful arms methodically raising and lowering the hammer, each blow sending a shower of sparks dancing into the shadows. The rhythmic clanging echoed through the modest workshop, a sound that had once brought him peace, but now served only to mask the tumult in his mind. With deliberate care, he set aside the half-formed horseshoe and plunged it into a barrel of water. Steam hissed upward, momentarily obscuring his face in a ghostly veil. When it cleared, his reflection wavered in the dark water, a face lined with worry, grey eyes haunted by memories fresh and painful. The cut on his arm throbbed beneath its crude bandage, a tangible reminder of his reckless intervention in a forest. "What were you thinking?" he muttered to himself, reaching for a rag to wipe the sweat from his brow. His fingers trembled slightly, not from exertion, but from the lingering shock of what he had done. 30 men. He had killed 30 men to save her, Princess Eleanor. Even thinking her name sent a jolt through him. He had recognized her instantly in the forest. How could he not? Her face adorned coins and proclamations throughout the realm. But it was more than that. Something about her had called to him, had pulled him from the shadows where he had always taken refuge. Aidan moved to the back of his workshop, listening carefully for any sounds outside. Satisfied that he was truly alone, he lifted a loose floorboard beneath his workbench and retrieved a small wooden box, weathered by age and handling. He opened it with reverent care, revealing its single treasure, a silver medallion, tarnished by time, but still bearing the unmistakable royal crest of England. "Mother," he whispered, tracing the emblem with his calloused fingertip. The medallion was all he had of her, a woman whose face he had never seen, whose voice he had never heard. A woman who, if the whispered tales were true, had been banished from court and died in exile to protect a secret that could have toppled the kingdom, the secret of his birth. Old Thomas and Mary, the kindly blacksmith and his wife who had raised him, had been vague about his origins. "Your mother entrusted you to us," they would say when he asked. "She made us promise to keep you safe, to teach you a trade, to keep you far from court." Only on her deathbed had Mary finally whispered the truth that had always hovered just beyond his grasp. He was the old king's bastard son, born of a forbidden love with a lady-in-waiting. "Blood of kings runs in your veins, boy," she had told him, her voice fading. "But that blood would see you dead if certain people knew." Aidan closed the box with a snap and returned it to its hiding place. For nearly 40 years he had lived quietly, drawing no attention, nursing no ambitions beyond his forge. He had accepted his lot, even found contentment in the honest labor of a blacksmith. Until today. "Fool," he chastised himself, returning to the anvil. "One moment of madness and you risk everything." Yet even as he resumed his work, hammering with renewed vigor, as if to beat his fears into submission, he could not banish the memory of Eleanor's eyes, wide with fear, then wonder, then something else entirely, as they had locked with his. In that moment, he had felt seen in a way he never had before. The sound of horses outside jerked him from his reverie. Quickly he moved to the door, peering through a crack in the weathered wood. His heart nearly stopped at the sight of royal guards, their cloaks bearing the king's crest, moving through the village square. "They're searching for him in every village," came a voice from the street. "The princess is offering a reward." Aidan stepped back, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow. It had begun already. The search for the mysterious savior from the forest. He had known it would happen, yet somehow had hoped for more time. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay on his simple cot, staring at the ceiling rafters, his mind racing. Between memories and fears, the wisdom of years told him to flee, to abandon the forge and disappear into the vast wilderness beyond the kingdom's borders. Yet something stronger than wisdom held him in place, a pull he could not explain, toward a destiny he had spent his life avoiding. Miles away, in the royal castle, Princess Eleanor stood at her chamber window, her gaze fixed on the distant village lights twinkling in the darkness. Her ladies-in-waiting had long since given up trying to coax her to bed. The king himself had visited earlier, concerned about her obsession with finding the mysterious man from the forest. "He saved my life, father," she had insisted, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. 30 armed men, and he faced them alone. "I must know who he is. Even if he is just a common blacksmith, as the survivors of your guard claim," the king had asked, his tone gentle but probing. Eleanor had turned to him then, something fierce and uncompromising in her gaze. "Especially if he is." Now, alone, with her thoughts, she pressed a hand against the cool glass of the window. Somewhere out there was the man with steel-gray eyes and hands that wielded death, yet moved with such gentleness when he had knelt beside her. A contradiction wrapped in mystery. "I will find you," she whispered to the night, her breath fogging the glass, "no matter how long it takes." As dawn broke over the kingdom, two souls, separated by birth, status, and circumstance, faced the same uncertain future, drawn together by an encounter that had lasted mere minutes, yet altered the course of both their lives. Aidan the blacksmith, keeper of a dangerous secret, and Princess Eleanor, a woman whose determination would shake the very foundations of the realm. Neither knew that their paths would cross again much sooner than expected, nor the price that would be paid when they did. 3 months had passed since the attack in the forest, yet the memory remained as vivid in Eleanor's mind as if it had happened yesterday. The royal court had long since returned to its usual rhythms of intrigue and festivities, but the princess moved through it all like a ghost, her thoughts elsewhere, her heart restless. This crisp autumn morning found her in her chambers, pacing, before a window that overlooked the castle's eastern gardens. The leaves had turned to rich golds and deep reds, swirling in the breeze like embers from an invisible fire. Eleanor barely noticed their beauty, her mind consumed with plans and possibilities. "Your Highness," came the soft voice of Beatrice, her most trusted lady-in-waiting. "The royal guards have returned from their latest search." Eleanor turned, hope flickering in her eyes, only to die as Beatrice shook her head. "Nothing, Your Highness. They've searched every blacksmith in the southern provinces. None match your description." Frustration rose within Eleanor's chest like a tide. For months, she had sent her best men to every corner of the kingdom, armed, with a description that had grown more detailed with each telling. A man of 40 years, tall and broad-shouldered, with chestnut hair and eyes the color of tempered steel. A blacksmith, judging by the hammer he wielded and the strength of his arms. Yet it was as if he had vanished into the very mist from which he had emerged. "Perhaps," Beatrice ventured carefully, "it's time to—" "No," Eleanor interrupted, her voice quiet but unyielding. "I will not give up. Not when I owe him my life." She moved to her wardrobe, pulling open its heavy doors with sudden determination. "Bring me my plainest dress and a cloak with a hood, and tell no one where I'm going." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Your Highness, you cannot mean to—" "I do," Eleanor said, already pulling out a simple brown dress, the kind worn by merchants' wives. "If the royal guards cannot find him, then perhaps Princess Eleanor cannot either. But a common woman might succeed where they have failed." An hour later, a figure slipped through the castle servants' entrance, face concealed beneath a rough-spun hood, bearing little resemblance to the regal princess known throughout the land. Eleanor felt a thrill of both fear and excitement as she made her way through the lower town, blending with the common folk who paid her no mind, just another woman going about her business. Her destination was the market day at Oakenfield, a village 2 hours' ride from the castle. Unlike previous searches, which had focused on larger towns, Eleanor had decided to try the smaller, more remote settlements, places where a man might hide if he wished to remain unseen. The village market was a riot of color and sound. Farmers called out the virtues of their produce. Cloth merchants displayed vibrant fabrics from distant lands, and the air was thick with the scents of freshly baked bread and roasting meats. Eleanor moved through it all in a daze, overwhelmed by the rawness of life unfiltered by court etiquette. She had almost given up hope when the rhythmic sound of metal striking metal caught her attention. Following the sound, she found herself before a modest stall at the market's edge, where a man was demonstrating his craft, sharpening a farmer's blade with practiced precision. Eleanor's heart stopped in her chest. There he was, the man from the forest, bent over his work, his profile illuminated by the autumn sun. His chestnut hair, slightly longer now, was tied back from his face, revealing the strong line of his jaw. His forearms, exposed by rolled-up sleeves, were corded with muscle, the skin marked by the small burns and scars of his trade. And though she could not see them, she knew his eyes would be that same haunting grey that had looked into hers on that fateful morning. For a long moment, Eleanor stood frozen, unable to approach, afraid that if she moved, he might vanish like morning mist. She watched as he finished sharpening the blade, tested its edge with his thumb, and handed it back to the farmer with a few quiet words. His movements were economical, his manner reserved, yet courteous. Nothing about him suggested a man capable of single-handedly defeating 30 armed bandits. Gathering her courage, Eleanor stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. As if sensing her presence, Aidan looked up, and their eyes met across the crowded marketplace. The world around them seemed to fall away. Eleanor saw recognition flash in his eyes, followed by disbelief, then something close to panic. For his part, Aidan felt as though the ground had dropped from beneath his feet. It was her, the princess, here in the village, standing before his stall, dressed like a common woman. But her eyes gave her away, those storm blue eyes that had haunted his dreams for months. "It was you," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the market's din. "In the forest." Aidan's hands stilled on the blade he'd been polishing. He glanced around quickly, checking if anyone had heard her words or was paying them undue attention. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. A trembling breath escaped Eleanor's lips. After months of searching, of obsession that had nearly driven her to madness, he was here, real, flesh and blood. Not a phantom conjured by her traumatized mind, as some at court had suggested. "Your arm," she said, noticing a scar peeking from beneath his sleeve, the wound he had received defending her. Did it heal well? The intimacy of the question seemed to startle him. "Yes," he replied, his voice low and cautious. "Your Highness should not be here. It isn't safe. And yet I am safer near you than anywhere else in the kingdom, it seems," Eleanor countered, a small smile playing at her lips. Something flashed in Aidan's eyes, a warmth quickly suppressed. "You don't know me," he said, his tone flat. "Then, let me," Eleanor urged, stepping closer. "Tell me your name at least, the name of the man who saved my life." He hesitated, conflict evident in the tightening of his jaw. Finally, he said, "Aidan. My name is Aidan." "Aidan," Eleanor repeated, as if tasting the word. "And you are truly just a blacksmith?" Before he could answer, a commotion erupted at the market's entrance. Trumpets sounded, and a collective gasp went up from the gathered villagers as a procession of mounted knights entered the square, their armor gleaming in the autumn sun, their banners bearing the crest of Norwich. "Make way for His Grace, the Duke of Norwich," a herald proclaimed, his voice cutting through the market's buzz. Eleanor paled visibly. "No," she whispered. "Not here, not now." Aidan's expression darkened as he watched the procession. "The Duke," he said, his voice suddenly hard. "Your betrothed, the..." Word hung between them like a physical barrier. Eleanor opened her mouth to explain, to deny, but the words wouldn't come. How could she tell this man, this stranger, that her impending marriage to the Duke of Norwich was a political arrangement, one she had been dreading with increasing intensity since the day in the forest? "I must go," Aidan said abruptly already, gathering his tools with quick, efficient movements. "Forget you found me, Your Highness, for both our sakes." "Wait," Eleanor pleaded, reaching out to grasp his arm. The contact sent a jolt through them both, and for a moment they stood connected, her pale fingers stark against his sun-darkened skin. "Please, I need to..." But Aidan pulled away, his eyes now guarded. The warmth she had glimpsed earlier completely extinguished. "Goodbye, Princess," he said, the formal title creating distance between them, and then he was gone, slipping through the crowd with surprising agility for a man of his size, leaving Eleanor standing alone at the empty stall, her hand still outstretched, her heart in turmoil. Behind her, the Duke of Norwich's entourage drew closer, the sound of hooves on cobblestones like a ticking clock counting down to a future she had never wanted. Eleanor pulled her hood lower, concealing her face, and turned in the opposite direction. She had found her mysterious savior only to lose him again. But this time she knew his name. This time she knew where to find him, and this time she would not let him disappear so easily. Twilight descended over the kingdom like a velvet cloak. stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky as Eleanor's carriage passed through the castle gates. Her mind remained at the marketplace, replaying her brief encounter with Aidan, the recognition in his eyes, the sound of his voice saying her title with such careful distance, the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers when she had grasped his arm. Aidan, she whispered to herself, savoring the name she had sought for so long, a common name for a man who was anything but common. The castle courtyard was ablaze with torchlight, an unusual sight at this hour. Servants rushed about with purpose, and guards stood at attention in their finest regalia. Eleanor's heart sank as she realized what this meant. Her father had returned. "Princess Eleanor!" The chamberlain hurried to her carriage, his face flushed with relief. "Thank the heavens you've returned. The king awaits you in the great hall. He arrived an hour ago and has been asking for you most urgently." Eleanor stepped down, still dressed in her commoner's attire, earning a look of disapproval from the chamberlain. "I'll change immediately," she assured him, though her thoughts were already racing ahead to what her father's unexpected return might mean. King Richard had been away for months, visiting the northern territories to quell unrest that had arisen. In the wake of a harsh winter, his health had been fragile since a bout of fever the previous year, and Eleanor had worried for him daily during his absence. But now, a new fear took root in her heart. A fear not for her father, but for what his return might hasten. Her suspicions were confirmed the moment she entered the great hall, now dressed in a gown befitting her station. Her father sat upon his throne, looking thinner than she remembered, but with color in his cheeks and a brightness in his eyes she had not seen in years. Beside him stood the Duke of Norwich, tall and imposing in his finery, his cold blue eyes fixing on Eleanor with a proprietary gleam that made her skin crawl. "My daughter." King Richard rose, arms outstretched, his voice booming with renewed vigor. "Come, embrace your father who has missed you terribly." Eleanor hurried forward, genuinely glad to see him well, despite the circumstances. His embrace was stronger than she expected, and when they parted, she searched his face. "You look recovered, father. The northern air has done you good." "Indeed it has," the king agreed, his smile widening. "And I return with wonderful news. The Duke of Norwich has agreed to move forward with your betrothal without further delay. The wedding shall take place in a fortnight." The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She had known this day would come. The marriage had been arranged since her 35th birthday, a political alliance to secure the northern borders. But she had hoped for more time. Time to, what? Find a way out, or simply to know Aidan better, to understand why he had risked his life for hers, why his face haunted her dreams. "A fortnight," she repeated, fighting to keep her voice steady. "That is very soon, father." "Not soon enough," the Duke of Norwich interjected, stepping forward to take her hand in his. His fingers were cold, despite the warmth of the hall. "I have waited patiently for 3 years, Princess. I will wait no longer." Eleanor forced a smile, though it felt like a grimace on her face. "Of course, Your Grace. I simply meant that there is much to prepare." "The preparations have already begun," her father said, gesturing to the bustling servants. "This kingdom will see a celebration like none before. My only daughter, wed at last, to secure our northern borders and bring peace to the realm." That night, Eleanor stood at her chamber window, as had become her habit, but now her gaze was not searching. She knew where to find Aidan. The question was whether she should. In a fortnight she would be the Duchess of Norwich, bound by vows before God and kingdom. What right had she to seek out a blacksmith, to nurture this strange connection between them, knowing it could lead nowhere? Yet as she watched the distant lights of the village, she knew she would go to him again, once more, before her fate was sealed. Miles away, in his small cottage attached to the forge, Aidan sat alone before a dying fire. the silver medallion in his palm gleaming in the low light. The encounter at the market had shaken him deeply. For months, he had convinced himself that the princess would eventually abandon her search, that their paths would never cross again. He had been wrong. The memory of her standing before his stall, her eyes wide with recognition, had stirred something. Within him, he had long thought dormant, a yearning for connection, for something beyond the solitary life he had built for himself. "Fool," he muttered, closing his fingers around the medallion. "She is to marry the Duke of Norwich. She is a princess, and you are—" What was he? A blacksmith with a secret that could topple kingdoms. A bastard son with royal blood that made him both valuable and dangerous. A man who had spent his life hiding, only to risk everything in one impulsive moment of heroism. With a sigh, Aidan rose and moved to the small chest at the foot of his bed. He unlocked it with a key kept on a leather cord around his neck and carefully placed the medallion inside, nestled among the few treasures of his past. A small portrait of the couple who had raised him, a leather-bound book of poetry his adoptive mother had taught him to read with, and a dagger with an intricately carved hilt, the only gift his adoptive father had ever given him. As he closed the chest, a knock at his door startled him. Visitors at this hour were rare, and after today's encounter, he was wary of any unexpected arrivals. Silently, he took the dagger from the chest and moved to the door. "Who calls?" he asked, one hand on the latch, the other gripping the dagger behind his back. "A friend," came the reply, the voice unmistakably female and cultured, despite its attempt at discretion. Aidan's heart thundered in his chest. It couldn't be. She wouldn't dare. He opened the door a crack, and there she stood, Princess Eleanor, once again dressed as a commoner, her face partially concealed by a hood, but her eyes unmistakable in the moonlight. "Your Highness," he said, his voice tight with tension. "This is madness." "Perhaps," she agreed, her gaze steady despite the risk she was taking, "but I had to see you again. May I come in?" Every instinct told Aidan to send her away, to close the door and bar it, to protect the secret he had guarded his entire life. But as he looked into her eyes, he found himself stepping aside, allowing her to enter his humble home. The princess of the realm, crossing the threshold of a blacksmith's cottage, two worlds colliding in defiance of everything he had ever known. As Eleanor passed him, the scent of roses and something uniquely her own filled his senses. He closed the door behind her, acutely aware that with this simple action, both their lives had changed irrevocably. The weight of his blood, of his secret, had never felt heavier than in this moment, as the woman he had saved now unknowingly risked everything by standing in his home. And despite every reason to fear this encounter, Aidan found himself unable to regret it. The royal castle blazed with light, every window aglow, as if trying to rival the stars themselves on this crisp autumn night. Inside the grand ballroom, hundreds of candles in crystal chandeliers cast their golden radiance upon the assembled nobility of the realm, gathered to celebrate the imminent wedding of Princess Eleanor to the Duke of Norwich. Music from a string ensemble filled the air, providing a melodious backdrop to the swish of silk gowns and the murmur of courtly conversation. Yet amidst all this splendor, Eleanor stood apart, a solitary figure by a marble column, observing the revelry with detached eyes. She wore a gown of midnight blue, embroidered with silver thread that caught the light with every breath, a small half-mask of matching hue concealing the upper portion of her face, as did every guest, for this was the traditional masquerade. Ball held before royal weddings, where identities were playfully obscured and social boundaries temporarily blurred. "Your Highness appears deep in thought," came a voice to her right, the Duke of Norwich, his tall frame unmistakable despite the black mask covering his features. "Are you not pleased with the celebrations?" Eleanor turned to him, forcing a smile to her lips. The ball is magnificent, Your Grace. I was merely taking it all in. Indeed. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly behind his mask. And not perhaps searching the crowd for someone in particular? A chill ran through Eleanor at his words. Did he know of her clandestine visit to Aidan's cottage 3 nights ago? Of the hours they had spent talking by firelight, sharing stories? Of their lives, carefully circling the growing attraction between them? I don't know what you mean, she replied, keeping her voice level. The Duke's laugh was like ice cracking. Come now, Eleanor. The entire court whispers of your obsession with finding the mysterious man from the forest. Even your father has noticed. Your distraction these past months. Relief flooded through her. He suspected but did not know. It was natural to want to thank the man who saved my life, she said. Nothing more. Of course. The Duke inclined his head, though disbelief was evident in his posture. Well, soon enough, your attention will be fully occupied with wifely duties. I shall see to that. As he moved away to greet an arriving dignitary, Eleanor suppressed a shudder. 1 week until the wedding. 1 week until this man would have authority over her life, her body, her future. The thought was unbearable. Her gaze drifted to the great doors of the ballroom, and her heart leapt into her throat. There, hesitating at the threshold, stood a figure she would recognize anywhere, despite the mask covering half his face. Aidan had come. She had sent him the invitation in secret, a folded parchment delivered by her most trusted handmaiden, begging him to attend the masquerade, where his common birth would be concealed behind a mask like everyone else's. She had not dared to hope he would actually appear. Yet there he stood, magnificent and utterly out of place in borrowed finery. A deep green doublet over a crisp white shirt, black breeches and polished boots. His chestnut hair was neatly tied back, and a simple emerald mask covered the upper portion of his face. Despite the elegant clothing, there was no disguising the powerful build of a man who had spent his life at the forge, nor the wary alertness in his posture as he surveyed the glittering crowd. Eleanor moved toward him, as if pulled by an invisible thread, weaving through groups of laughing courtiers, nodding absently to those who bowed as she passed. When she reached him, she saw uncertainty flicker in those grey eyes she had come to know so well. "You came," she said softly, her voice hardly more than a whisper. "Against my better judgment," Aidan replied, his gaze darting around the ballroom. "This is madness, Eleanor." The sound of her name on his lips, her name, not her title, sent a thrill through her. Since that night in his cottage, when formality had finally fallen away between them, she had cherished every utterance of those 3 syllables in his deep voice. "Dance with me," she said, extending her hand. He hesitated, then took it, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. "I don't know the steps," he admitted, as she led him to the edge of the dance floor. "Just follow my lead," Eleanor replied, placing his hand on her waist and taking position. "And remember, tonight you are simply another masked guest. No one will question your presence." As the music swelled, they began to move together, Aidan following Eleanor's subtle guidance with the same grace he had shown in battle. His initial stiffness gradually melted away, and soon they were gliding across the polished floor as if they had danced together 100 times before. "Why did you ask me here?" Aidan murmured, his face close to hers as the dance brought them together. "Why risk exposure like this?" Eleanor's eyes, visible behind her mask, held a mix of defiance and vulnerability. "Because in 1 week, I will be bound forever to a man I cannot love. Because I needed to see you once more in a place where we could pretend, just for a night, that the world outside doesn't exist." The raw honesty in her words seemed to shake him. His hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her waist. "Eleanor, no," she interrupted. "Don't tell me why this can't be. Don't remind me of duty or station or the gulf between us. Just dance with me, please." And so they danced, song after song, moving together as if created for this purpose, oblivious to the curious glances and whispered speculations that followed them across the floor. For Eleanor, the rest of the ballroom faded to a blur of color and light, leaving only Aidan's face, the warmth of his hands, the subtle scent of forge smoke that clung to him despite his fine clothes. As the night deepened and the moon rose high, above the castle, they found themselves on a secluded balcony, breathless from dancing, the cool air a welcome relief after the heat of the ballroom. Below them, the royal gardens stretched into darkness, the carefully tended hedges and flower, beds silvered by moonlight. "I should go," Aidan said, though he made no move to leave. "The longer I stay, the greater the risk." Eleanor stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "Remove your mask," she whispered. "What?" "Please. I want to see your face properly. Here, in the moonlight." Slowly, Aidan reached up and untied the ribbon that held his mask in place. It fell away, revealing the strong lines of his face, the slight cleft in his chin, the scar above his right eyebrow that she had first noticed in his cottage. Without thinking, Eleanor reached up to trace it with her fingertips. "How did you get this?" she asked. "My first day at the forge," he replied, his voice hoarse. "I was 10 years old and too eager to prove myself." Eleanor smiled, her fingers lingering against his skin. "And yet you returned to the forge the next day." "I did," he acknowledged. "Some paths once begun cannot be abandoned." The double meaning in his words hung between them, as tangible as the night air. Eleanor's hand moved from his scar to his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of stubble beneath her palm. "Eleanor," Aidan whispered, his eyes dark with an emotion she had not seen there before. "We cannot." She silenced him by pressing her lips to his. For a heartbeat, he remained still, as if frozen by her boldness. Then, with a sound somewhere between surrender and relief, his arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him as he returned her kiss with a passion that stole her breath. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft, moving against hers with a tenderness that belied his strength. Eleanor melted into him, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair, loosening the ribbon that bound it. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling. Aidan rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "If anyone saw, I don't care," Eleanor said fiercely, her fingers still woven through his hair. "For once in my life, I want something for myself, not for the kingdom, not for my father's political alliances." Before Aidan could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps caused them both to stiffen. Eleanor quickly stepped back, adjusting her mask while Aidan scrambled to replace his own. "Princess Eleanor?" The Duke of Norwich's voice carried through the night air, sharp with suspicion. "Are you out here? Go!" Eleanor whispered urgently to Aidan. "Through the garden. There's a servants' gate in the south wall." Aidan hesitated, his eyes locked with hers in a silent promise. Then he vaulted over the balcony railing, landing noiselessly on the soft earth below before disappearing into the shadows of the garden. A moment later, the Duke stepped onto the balcony, his mask removed, his cold eyes scanning the darkness beyond. "Ah, there you are," he said, turning to Eleanor. "And who was your dancing partner?" He seemed remarkably common in his movements. "Just a visiting nobleman," Eleanor replied, forcing lightness into her tone. "I didn't catch his name." The Duke's lips curved in a smile that did not reach his eyes. "How curious. Because I intend to catch it and him before the night is through." As he offered his arm to escort her back to the ballroom, Eleanor cast one last glance at the garden where Aidan had vanished. Their kiss still burned on her lips, a sensation she knew would haunt her dreams long after this night had ended. Rain pounded against the windows of Aidan's forge, the late autumn storm unleashing its fury upon the small village of Oakenfield. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls as Aidan worked a piece of glowing metal with methodical precision. Each strike of his hammer punctuated the drumming of raindrops, creating a rhythm that might have been soothing on any other day, but not today. Not when the Duke of Norwich's men had been seen in the village, asking questions about a blacksmith who had attended the royal masquerade. Aidan had known it was a risk to accept Eleanor's invitation, yet he had been unable to refuse. The memory of their dance, of her body moving in perfect harmony with his, of her lips pressed against his own in that moonlit moment on the balcony. These thoughts had consumed him for 3 days and nights since the ball. Even now, as danger closed in around him, he could not bring himself to regret it. The sound of hoofbeats on the muddy road outside snapped him from his reverie. Aidan set down his hammer and moved to the small window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. His heart nearly stopped at the sight of a lone rider, cloaked and hooded against the storm, dismounting before his forge. He knew it was her even before she threw back her hood, revealing the face that had haunted his dreams for months. Eleanor's hair was darkened by rain, her fine cloak sodden, but her eyes burned with the same intensity they had held on the night of the masquerade. Aidan unbolted the door, pulling her inside and out of the downpour. "Are you mad?" he demanded, his voice rough with concern. "Coming here in broad daylight, with the Duke's men searching the village?" Eleanor's chest heaved as she caught her breath, rainwater dripping from her clothes to form a puddle on the packed earth floor. "They know, Aidan," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "The Duke's spies identified you at the ball. They know. You're the man from the forest. They're coming for you." Aidan's face hardened as he secured the door. "How long do we have?" "Hours, perhaps less," Eleanor replied, pushing wet strands of hair from her face. "I rode ahead of them, but they won't be far behind." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the forge fire and the relentless drumming of rain on the roof. Aidan moved to a small cupboard, retrieving a rough cloth, which he offered to Eleanor. She took it gratefully, dabbing at her face and hair. "You risked everything to warn me," Aidan said quietly, watching her with those steel-grey eyes that seemed to see through to her very soul. Eleanor met his gaze unflinchingly. "As you risked everything to save me in the forest." Something shifted in Aidan's expression then, a decision reached after long internal struggle. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "Something I should have told you long ago." He moved to the back of the forge, to the workbench where he spent countless hours creating beauty from raw metal. Kneeling, he pried up a loose floorboard and extracted a small wooden box, weathered by age and handling. When he returned to Eleanor's side, his face bore an expression she had never seen before, vulnerability mingled with a deep, ancient fear. "What I'm about to show you," he said, holding the box in his calloused hands, "is the reason I ran that day in the forest. Why I've lived my entire life in hiding. Why I can never claim—" He broke off, swallowing hard. "Why I can never claim what my heart desires most." With deliberate care, he opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a silver medallion. Even tarnished by time, the royal crest was unmistakable. The same crest Eleanor had worn since birth, the symbol of her lineage and her claim to the throne. "I don't understand," she whispered, looking from the medallion to Aidan's face. "How did you come to possess this?" Aidan took a deep breath, as if preparing to lift an immense weight. "It belonged to my mother," he said, "a lady in waiting to the Queen, and the secret lover of your grandfather, King Henry." Eleanor's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You're saying I am the bastard son of Prince Richard, your father's brother who died before you were born," Aidan confirmed, his voice steady despite the enormity of his confession. "My mother was sent away when her pregnancy was discovered, given to a blacksmith and his wife to raise as their own. She died shortly after my birth, leaving only this medallion as proof of my heritage." Eleanor stood motionless, her mind reeling. as she processed his words. Aidan, the blacksmith who had saved her life, the man whose touch ignited something within her that no other had ever awakened, was her cousin. Royal blood flowed in his veins, the same blood that gave her the right to the throne. All these years, she breathed. "You've kept this secret." Aidan nodded grimly. "My adoptive parents warned me from childhood that if my existence were ever discovered, it could mean my death. A bastard with royal blood is a threat to the legitimate line, a potential rallying point for rebels and usurpers." He closed the box with finality, as if shutting away not just the medallion, but the burden of his birth. "Now you understand why. Why we cannot." Eleanor stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "No," she said firmly, "I understand why you were afraid, why you've lived your life in hiding, but this changes nothing of what I feel." "Eleanor," Aidan protested, though he did not move away when she placed her hand on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath rough linen. "We share blood. I am your cousin. And you are also the man who risked his life. To save mine," she countered. "The man who sees me not as a princess to be bartered for political advantage, but as a woman." Her voice softened. "The man I love." The admission hung in the air between them, a truth finally spoken aloud after weeks of circling it in silence. Aidan's breath caught, his eyes darkening with emotion. For a long moment, he remained still, as if waging some final internal battle. Then, with a sound that was half surrender and half relief, he pulled her into his arms. This kiss was different from the one they had shared on the balcony, deeper, more desperate, edged with the knowledge of what they risked and what they stood to lose. Eleanor wound her arms around his neck, pressing herself against him as if trying to merge their very souls. Aidan's hands spanned her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground in his fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Aidan rested his forehead against hers. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you in that forest," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion, terrified, yet refusing to beg for your life. "I knew then that you were unlike any woman I had ever known." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she cradled his face in her hands. "And I have loved you since you knelt beside me among the dead, checking my wounds with hands that had just dealt death yet touched me with such gentleness." The sound of distant hoofbeats shattered the moment. Aidan tensed, his expression hardening as he moved to the window. "Riders," he said grimly, "at least a dozen approaching from the south road." "The Duke's men," Eleanor whispered, fear gripping her heart. "Aidan, you must flee, now." But Aidan shook his head, a strange calm settling over his features. "No, I'm tired of running, of hiding who I am." He turned to her, resolution in his eyes. "If I am to claim you, to stand against the Duke of Norwich and your father's plans, then I must do so as my true self, not as a blacksmith, but as a son of the royal house." "They'll kill you," Eleanor protested, gripping his arms. "The Duke will never allow a rival claimant to live, especially one who holds my heart." Aidan smiled then, a fierce, determined smile that reminded her of the man who had emerged from the mist to face 30 bandits without fear. "Then we must ensure he has no choice." He moved quickly to a chest in the corner of the forge, withdrawing. A sword he had clearly crafted himself, perfectly balanced, with a hilt inlaid with subtle royal symbols. "I had hoped never to need this," he said, testing the blade's edge with his thumb. "But I forged it nonetheless, a reminder of the heritage I could never openly claim." As the hoofbeats grew louder, Eleanor made her decision. She moved to stand beside Aidan, her hand finding his, their fingers intertwining. "Whatever comes," she said, her voice steady despite her fear, "we face it together." Aidan brought her hand to his lips, pressing a fervent kiss to her knuckles. "Together," he agreed, his eyes holding a promise that transcended their uncertain future. And as the Duke of Norwich's men surrounded the small forge, weapons drawn and faces grim with purpose, Eleanor and Aidan stood side by side. Princess and blacksmith, royalty and commoner, two halves of a whole that fate had both divided and inexorably drawn together. Darkness had fallen when Eleanor and Aidan crept from the rear of the forge, leaving behind the smouldering remains of what had once been his home and livelihood. The Duke's men had been momentarily fooled by their escape through a hidden passage Aidan had built years ago, a precaution born of a lifetime of secrecy. Now, cloaked in the night's shadows and the lingering mist from the day's rainfall, they made their way through the dense forest that bordered the village. "We have until dawn before they realize we've slipped away," Aidan whispered, his hand firmly gripping Eleanor's as he guided her through the tangled undergrowth. The sword he had forged hung at his hip, occasionally catching what little moonlight penetrated the canopy above. Eleanor nodded, her breath visible in the chill night air. She had exchanged her fine, rain-soaked cloak for a rough woolen one Aidan had kept stored alongside emergency provisions in his escape tunnel. With her hair hastily braided and tucked beneath a hood, she looked nothing like the regal princess who had danced at the masquerade ball just days ago. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the soft squelch of their boots in the muddy forest floor. Aidan's face was a study in concentration as he navigated familiar paths made treacherous by darkness. "There's a monastery 3 days' ride north," he replied. "The abbot there once sheltered my adoptive father when he fled conscription. He may offer us sanctuary until we decide our next move." They pressed on through the night, stopping only when the terrain became too dangerous to traverse. In darkness, in the small clearing sheltered by ancient oaks, Aidan built a modest fire, careful to keep it small enough that the smoke would not betray their position. Eleanor watched him, this man who moved with such quiet competence, whether at his forge or in the wild. His profile in the firelight was strong, determined, yet she could see the weight of their situation in the tightness around his eyes, the set of his jaw. "I'm sorry," she said softly as he settled beside her on a fallen log. "Your home, your forge, you've lost everything because of me." Aidan turned to her, his steel-grey eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "No," he said firmly, taking her cold, hands in his warm ones. "I've gained everything that matters." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms. "For 30 years, I've lived half a life, Eleanor. Always hiding, always afraid, forging beautiful things for others while denying myself the one thing I truly wanted." "And what was that?" she asked, though something in her heart already knew the answer. "Connection," he replied simply. "To be known, truly known by another soul." His gaze softened as it held hers. "Even if we're caught tomorrow, I wouldn't trade these moments with you for 1,000 years of safe isolation." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "Nor would I trade them for 1,000 years of pampered imprisonment in a loveless marriage." They remained thus for a long moment, breathing the same air, drawing strength from each other's presence. When Aidan finally pulled back, it was only to cup her face in his calloused hands and kiss her with a tenderness that belied the desperate nature of their circumstances. Dawn found them already, moving again, having slept little but finding renewed determination in the light of a new day. They had acquired 2 horses from a farmer loyal to Aidan, an old man who had benefited from the blacksmith's generosity over the years and asked no questions when presented with their need. As they rode through dappled forest paths, Eleanor felt a strange lightness despite the gravity of their situation. For the first time in her life, she was making her own choices, following her heart rather than the dictates of duty and station. The uncertainty of their future, rather than terrifying her, exhilarated her in ways she had never anticipated. "You're smiling," Aidan observed as they paused to water their horses at a clear forest stream. The morning sun filtered through the golden autumn leaves above, casting him in a warm glow that softened the worry lines on his face. Eleanor hadn't realized she was. "I suppose I am," she admitted, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Is that strange, given our circumstances?" Aidan's own lips curved upward in response. "Not strange at all," he said. "Freedom often has that effect, even when it comes at great cost." They continued northward, alternating between well-worn paths and more obscure routes that Aidan seemed to know by instinct. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the village, yet both remained vigilant, aware that the Duke's men would not easily abandon their pursuit. It was as they crested a hill overlooking a vast expanse of open countryside that they heard it, the unmistakable sound of approaching hoofbeats, many horses moving at speed. Eleanor turned to Aidan, alarm widening her eyes. "Quickly!" he urged, guiding his horse toward a dense thicket of trees to their right. "If we can reach the forest before they spot us—" But it was too late. From their elevated position on the hillside, they were clearly visible to the approaching riders, who immediately altered course toward them with shouts that carried on the wind. "Ride!" Aidan commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. "Don't stop! Don't look back!" They spurred their horses forward, racing toward the distant tree line with desperate speed. Eleanor's heart pounded in time with her mount's thundering hooves, the wind whipping tears from her eyes as they fled. She could hear Aidan beside her, urging his horse onward, his face set in grim determination. The forest loomed closer, promising shelter, but the sounds of pursuit grew louder with each passing moment. Eleanor risked a glance over her shoulder and felt her blood freeze. A dozen riders bearing the Duke of Norwich's colours, closing the distance with alarming speed. "Aidan!" she cried in warning. He looked back, made a split-second assessment, and made a decision that changed everything. "Keep riding," he shouted to her. "I'll hold them off." Before she could protest, he had wheeled his horse around, drawing his sword in one fluid motion as he prepared to face their pursuers alone. "No!" Eleanor reined in her horse so sharply that it reared in protest. "I won't leave you." Their eyes met across the distance that had already opened between them, a look so filled with love and fierce determination that it stole Eleanor's breath. "Trust me," Aidan called to her. "I'll find you. I swear it on my blood. Our blood." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she recognized the echo of that day in the forest. Aidan, outnumbered yet unflinching, preparing to risk everything for her safety. History repeating itself in the cruelest of ways. "I love you," she cried, the words carried away by the wind, even as she reluctantly turned her horse toward the forest once more. "And I you," came his reply, the last thing she heard before the clash of steel drowned out all else. Eleanor rode blindly, her vision blurred. By tears, her heart torn between the need to escape and the desperate desire to turn back. The sounds of battle faded behind her as she entered the forest, the dense canopy muffling the world outside as effectively as a heavy blanket. She had ridden perhaps a mile when a different sound reached her ears. Not the clash of swords or shouts of men, but the clear, unmistakable call of a hunting horn. 3 long blasts followed by 2 short ones, the royal signal to stand down. Eleanor reined in her horse, listening intently as the call was repeated. This was no trick of the Duke's men. This was a royal command, one that every soldier in the realm was bound to obey. With a surge of hope she scarcely dared to trust, Eleanor turned her mount and rode back toward the edge of the forest. What she found in the clearing beyond left her momentarily speechless. The Duke's men had indeed stood down, their weapons sheathed as they formed a respectful circle around 3 figures at the center. One was Aidan, still mounted, his sword lowered but ready. The second was the Duke of Norwich himself, his face contorted with barely contained rage. And the third, To Eleanor's utter astonishment was her father, King Richard, looking far healthier than when she had last seen him, his expression a complex mixture of concern, relief, and something she had rarely witnessed directed at her: respect. "Father," she breathed, urging her horse forward until she reached Aidan's side. His free hand immediately sought hers, their fingers intertwining in a silent promise. "Eleanor," the king acknowledged, his gaze shifting between his daughter and the man beside her. "It seems I have arrived at a most opportune moment." The Duke of Norwich stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Your Majesty, this man is a criminal who has abducted the princess and—" "Silence," the king commanded, with a sharpness that caused the Duke to physically recoil. "I would hear from my daughter first." Eleanor straightened in her saddle, drawing strength from Aidan's steady presence. "I was not abducted, father. I chose to leave with Aidan rather than marry a man I cannot love. And this blacksmith," the king said, eyeing Aidan with careful assessment, "you believe him worthy of throwing away a strategic alliance that could secure peace for our kingdom?" Before Eleanor could respond, Aidan spoke, his voice clear and unwavering. "Your Majesty, I am more than a blacksmith." He reached into his tunic and withdrew the silver medallion, holding it up so that the royal crest caught the sunlight. "I am the son of Prince Richard, your brother, and Lady Elaine of the House of Westmoreland." A collective gasp arose from the assembled soldiers. The king's face paled slightly, but his expression remained inscrutable as he studied the medallion. "So," he said quietly, "the rumors were true. My brother did father a child before his death." His eyes narrowed. "Why reveal yourself now, after all these years in hiding?" Aidan's gaze remained steady. "Because I love your daughter, your Majesty, and because I would rather die as who I truly am than live another day as less than whole." A tense silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the soft nickering of horses and the rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze. Eleanor held her breath, her hand still firmly clasped in Aidan's, as her father considered the man who claimed both royal blood and her heart. Finally, to everyone's astonishment, the king smiled, a small, wry curve of his lips that spoke of decisions made and burdens lifted. "It seems," he said, "that the blood of kings recognizes its own, even across years of separation." He gestured toward the medallion. "My brother gave that to your mother on the eve of his last battle, did he not?" Aidan nodded, surprise evident in his expression. "You knew of their relationship, I suspected," the king admitted. "Richard confided many things to me before his death." His gaze shifted to Eleanor, softening perceptibly, including his belief that love, not politics, should guide one's choice of partner. The Duke of Norwich stepped forward again, his face a mask of outrage. "This is preposterous. Even if this man is of royal blood, he is still a bastard with no right to—" "No right to what, precisely?" the king interrupted, his voice dangerously soft. "To love my daughter, to be loved by her in return." He straightened, suddenly every inch the monarch. "The betrothal is dissolved, your grace. You will return to your lands in the north immediately." The duke's face contorted with fury, but even he dared not challenge a direct royal command. With a stiff bow and a venomous glance at Eleanor and Aidan, he mounted his horse and departed, his men falling in behind him like shadows fleeing the dawn. As the sound of their departure faded, Eleanor finally allowed herself to breathe freely. She turned to Aidan, finding in his eyes the same stunned disbelief she felt in her own heart. Against all odds, against the weight of history and tradition, they had been granted a miracle. "Come," the king said, gesturing toward the south, "let us return to the castle. There is much to discuss, and a royal lineage to acknowledge properly." As they rode side by side toward a future neither had dared to imagine possible, Aidan leaned close to Eleanor, his voice for her ears alone. "Did you ever imagine it could end this way?" Eleanor smiled through tears of joy, her heart fuller than she had ever known it could be. "Not an ending," she corrected gently. "A beginning." Spring had come to the kingdom at last, breathing life into the land after the long, harsh winter. In the small village of Rivermead, nestled in a verdant valley far from the castle's imposing towers, apple blossoms drifted like snow across the cobblestone streets. The morning sun cast a golden glow over thatched roofs and garden plots, where the first tender shoots of vegetables pushed through the rich, dark soil. At the edge of the village stood a forge unlike any other, larger than most, with multiple workstations and an adjoining cottage, whose windows were filled with flowering herbs and whose door was painted a cheerful blue. Smoke curled from the forge's chimney, carrying with it the distinctive scent of hot metal and honest labor. Inside, Aidan worked with the same focused intensity he had always brought to his craft, though much else in his life had changed. His strong hands, scarred from years at the anvil, guided a delicate piece of silver with precision as he crafted what would become a coronation gift for a northern ally. Morning light streamed through the high windows, catching on the metal, and in his chestnut hair, now streaked with the occasional strand of silver, he paused, stretching his back as he evaluated his progress. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of revelation and adjustment. After King Richard had acknowledged him as his brother's son, granting him the title of Earl of Westmoreland, many had expected Aidan to abandon his trade for the comforts and privileges of court life. Instead, he had asked for this, a new forge in a quiet village, where he could continue the work that had defined him long before royal blood had been recognized in his veins. The door to the cottage opened, and Eleanor appeared, carrying a tray with bread still warm from the oven and 2 steaming mugs of cider. She wore a simple dress of forest green, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders rather than elaborately styled as it had been during her years at court. The only indication of her royal status was a single gold ring bearing the royal crest. A matching one adorned Aidan's left hand. "You've been at it since dawn," she chided gently, setting the tray on a workbench cleared of tools. "The gift isn't needed for another month." Aidan smiled, setting aside his tools to wash his hands in a nearby basin. "Old habits," he replied, drying his hands on a cloth before pulling her into his arms. "I was raised to believe that honest work begins with the sun." Eleanor nestled against him, breathing in the scent that was uniquely his, smoke and metal and the faint herbal soap she had made herself. "And I was raised to believe that princesses don't bake their own bread," she countered with a laugh. Yet here we are. Here they were indeed, husband and wife these 3 months past, having chosen a life that neither had been born to, but both had crafted with the same care Aidan brought to his metalwork. Their wedding had been a quiet affair, attended by the king and a handful of trusted friends, held in the royal chapel at midwinter when holly and evergreen had adorned the ancient stones. They broke their fast together in the warm forge, discussing the day ahead. Eleanor would visit a nearby farmer, whose child had fallen ill, bringing remedies she had learned to prepare from the village healer who had taken her as an apprentice. Aidan would finish the silver piece and then meet with the village council, where his practical wisdom was as valued as his royal connection. As they spoke, a messenger arrived, bearing the royal seal, a letter from King Richard, whose health had begun to fail again with the changing of seasons. Eleanor read it aloud, her voice catching slightly at her father's affectionate words and his request for their presence at the castle in a fortnight's time. "We should go," Aidan said softly, seeing the concern in her eyes. "He shouldn't be alone if his health is worsening." Eleanor nodded, folding the letter carefully. "I'll pack our things tomorrow." She hesitated, a small smile playing at her lips. There's something else I think he would wish to know in person. Aidan's brow furrowed in question, and Eleanor took his hand, guiding it to rest against her belly, still flat but harboring their greatest secret. His eyes widened in understanding, then filled with such naked joy that Eleanor felt tears spring to her own. "Are you certain?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. She nodded, covering his hand with her own. "The village midwife confirmed it yesterday. By winter's return, we will be 3. Aidan gathered her in his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength, pressing his lips to her forehead, her cheeks, and finally her mouth in a kiss that spoke of promises kept and dreams realized. When they parted, both were smiling through tears. 2 weeks later, they rode through the castle gates, greeted with the respect due their rank, but without the pomp that both had requested be dispensed with. The king received them in his private chambers rather than the throne room, his face gaunt but his eyes brightening at the sight of his daughter and the man who had become not just his son-in-law, but a trusted advisor. "Father," Eleanor said, embracing him carefully, noting how fragile he felt beneath his royal robes, "we came as soon as we received your letter." "My dear girl," the king replied, patting her hand, "and Aidan, it does these old eyes good to see you both." He gestured to chairs arranged near the fire. "Come sit, tell me of your life in that village you've chosen over all the castles I offered." They spoke for hours, sharing stories of their simple yet fulfilling life. Aidan's forge, flourishing as nobles from across the realm, commissioned his work. Eleanor's growing skill as a healer. The community they had built among people who valued them for themselves rather than their titles. As the conversation waned, Eleanor exchanged a glance with Aidan, who nodded encouragingly. "Father," she said, taking the king's weathered hand in hers, "we have news that we hoped might bring you joy." She paused, her smile radiant. "You are to be a grandfather come winter." The king's face transformed, years seeming to fall away as wonder and delight replaced the weariness that had marked his features. "A child," he breathed, looking from Eleanor to Aidan with shining eyes. "A continuation of our line, born of love rather than alliance." He squeezed Eleanor's hand. "Your mother would have been so proud." The mention of the Queen, gone these 15 years, brought a bittersweet pang to Eleanor's heart. "I wish she could have known Aidan," she said softly, "known the happiness he has brought me." "She knows," the king assured her, with the quiet certainty of a man who had loved deeply and lost. "Wherever she is, she knows." As twilight fell, casting long shadows through the chamber windows, the king's mood grew more solemn. "There is another reason I asked you here," he admitted, gesturing to a document on a nearby table. "My physicians say I have perhaps 6 months, no more. I have prepared for the succession." Eleanor's heart clenched at the confirmation of what she had suspected upon seeing him. "Father," he raised a hand to silence her. "No tears yet, my dear. I have lived a full life and seen my greatest wish fulfilled, your happiness." He turned to Aidan. "The document names Eleanor as my heir, as has always been her right, but it also acknowledges you, Aidan, as a legitimate member of the royal family through my brother's blood." Aidan bowed his head, humbled by the formal recognition. "Your Majesty," "Richard," the king corrected gently. "We are family after all." "Richard," Aidan amended, the name still strange on his tongue. "I never sought royal status or power. You know this." "I do," the king agreed, "which is precisely why I trust you with it." His gaze encompassed them both. "When I am gone, Eleanor will rule, but the burden of the crown is heavy for one pair of shoulders alone. She will need someone at her side who loves not power, but the kingdom and its people." His eyes, so like Eleanor's, held Aidan's steadily. "Someone like you." The three talked, long into the night, of governance and responsibility, of the future and the past, of the child who would be born into a world shaped by the choices they made now. By the time they retired to their chambers, a new understanding had been reached, one that honored both duty and the freedom they had fought so hard to claim. 3 days later, as they prepared to return to their village, the king embraced them both with surprising strength. "Visit often," he urged. "Let me see my grandchild grow within you, Eleanor, even if I may not live to hold them in my arms." "We will," she promised, blinking back tears. "And when the time comes for me to take the crown, we will rule as we have lived, with honesty, compassion, and the wisdom that comes from having known both palace and forge." The king died peacefully in his sleep 4 months later, having lived just long enough to place his hand on Eleanor's rounded belly and feel his grandchild kick in. Response. The kingdom mourned, none more deeply than Eleanor and Aidan, who stood together at his funeral, the new queen and her consort, united in grief and in determination to honor his legacy. When their son was born that winter, a strong boy with his father's grey eyes and his mother's determined spirit, they named him Richard, after the grandfather who had blessed their union and the great-uncle whose blood had given them both challenge and gift. Years passed, and the kingdom flourished under Eleanor's thoughtful rule and Aidan's practical counsel. Their forge in Rivermead remained, visited often when the burdens of court grew too heavy, a reminder of the life they had chosen and the love that had begun when a blacksmith emerged from the mist to save a princess. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they stood on the castle battlements watching their children, Richard, now joined by 2 sisters, play in the gardens below, Aidan turned to Eleanor, the silver in his hair now matching the threads in hers. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, quietly. "The life we might have had if we'd simply run away that day, lived as common folk without the weight of the crown." Eleanor considered the question, her eyes taking in the kingdom spread before them, peaceful, prosperous, a testament to their shared vision. Then she looked to their children, to the people in the courtyard going about their business, to the man beside her who had been her salvation in more ways than he would ever know. "Not for a moment," she replied, taking his hand. Still strong, still bearing the calluses of his craft despite his royal duties. "We found a different path, one neither of us was born to, but both of us were meant for." She smiled, the same smile that had captivated him that day in the marketplace so long ago. "And is that not the greatest adventure of all? To forge your own destiny from the raw materials life provides." Aidan's laugh was warm as he pulled her close, pressing his lips to her temple. "Always the poet," he murmured against her skin, "and always right." As the sun set behind distant mountains, casting the castle in hues of gold and amber, they remained there, hand in hand, the blacksmith and the princess who had defied tradition, expectation, and fate itself to write their own story, one of courage, sacrifice, and a love that had saved not just themselves, but an entire kingdom. And so ends the tale of Eleanor and Aidan, a princess and a blacksmith whose love transcended the rigid boundaries of medieval society, changing not only their own destinies, but the future of an entire kingdom. Their journey reminds us that sometimes the most powerful acts of courage are not those performed on battlefields or in throne rooms, but in the quiet moments when we choose love over fear, truth over comfort, and the unknown path over the safety of convention. What would you risk for a love that could cost you everything? Would you, like Eleanor, abandon the security of your station to follow your heart? Would you, like Aidan, step from the shadows of a lifetime of hiding to claim your true self, no matter the danger? Perhaps the greatest forges are not those that shape metal, but the fires of adversity that temper our souls and reveal who we truly are when everything we thought we knew is challenged. If this story touched your heart, please consider following, our channel for more tales that explore the depths of human emotion and the transformative power of love against impossible odds. Share with someone who needs to be reminded that our lives are not determined by birth or circumstance, but by the choices we make and the courage we find to forge our own destiny. Like, comment, and let us know which character's journey resonated most with you. For in sharing these reflections, we create a community united by timeless stories that echo across the centuries.